Hi folks, today we're going to have a look at Imtiaz Dharker's poem Living Space from the EDUQAS Poetry Anthology for English Literature. Now, if you look at this picture in front of you, this essentially captures the essence of what this poem is about. Within Living Space, Dharker presents to us a harrowing, yet somehow hopeful depiction of life in the Indian slums. And what she's really trying to do is to illustrate the precarious nature of life in the shanty towns. Now, before we move on to the poem itself, it's important that we flesh out some of the contextual details around the poem and the writer. This will get you marks for assessment objective 3. Now, Imtiaz Dharker had a very multicultural upbringing. She was born in Pakistan and moved to Glasgow at age 1. And now she divides her time between Wales, London and Mumbai. I believe she has also been doing some filming in Mumbai or assisting with some documentary making in Mumbai about the Indian slums. Now, her experiences of these different cultures are wholeheartedly reflected in her poetical output. Her poems often explore the theme of identity and home and what it means to have one, and also the place of women in society. So what it is crucial to note is that Dharker has an acute awareness of the Eastern world, and in particular the Asian subcontinent, whilst also having experience of living in the Western world and the Western sphere. And this division really between East and West is a subtle theme in this poem that is brought out at the start, as we'll see in a second. So if we dive into the poem, we'll see that it really begins with 3 pretty simple sentences. There are just not enough straight lines. That is the problem. Nothing is flat or parallel. Now, as you can see through me reading those, that they are very matter of fact. The tone is very blunt, very clinical. And this could create a sense of detachment from the speaker and the problem, and a sense of distance. But I think more so, really, it imbues the poem, at the start at least, with a sense of frustration, bordering on anger. There are just not enough straight lines. That's the problem. Nothing is flat or parallel. Now, before we move on, I just want to really draw your attention to these straight lines, the idea of the straight lines. If we look back at these pictures of the shanty towns, we can see that this is a very chaotic, disordered environment and far from symmetrical. So in a way, these straight lines become symbolic of order, and they represent a Western view of what a living space is, what a home is, what a building is. And if you look into the cities today, you'll find that most of the skyscrapers are very blockish, very straight, and very regimented. And this is a far cry from the world in which Dharker is trying to present here. Beams balance crookedly on supports. You'll notice, the eagle-eyed of you, that there is use of alliteration here between beams and balance. Now, this kind of draws these words together, but Dharker quite cleverly offsets this with the use of enjambment, splitting beams balance across 2 lines. There is no punctuation, no end stopping here to close the line. And what this does is create a tension between the enjambment and the alliteration, which creates in turn a contrast between order and chaos, stability and instability. And if you're unsure what I mean by that, if you think about the words beams balance, that alliteration draws those words together and connects them almost. Whereas the enjambment and the fact that it's been split across 2 lines pulls them apart. So we've got this constant kind of flux and change. And that is reflected also in the rhyme, which I'm going to talk about in a second. I've also drawn attention to this word crookedly. Now, I think this is a clever word use here from Dharker. When we often describe someone as crooked or a crooked policeman, it means that they're corrupt. And I think that these crooked buildings is a subtle, really, allusion to a corrupt class system, a corrupt world and of inequality. And I'll delve into that idea a little bit more later. As I've spoken about, this constant juxtaposition between order and chaos, stability and instability is also highlighted in these words in red. Now, if you'll see, they all rhyme. That flat beam seems But these rhymes, as you can see, are just peppered in all throughout the poem. There's no set scheme or structure. So there are some elements of rhyme here that provide moments of order and design in amongst this scene of apparent chaos. And lastly, here at the bottom, we see that these nails are clutching at open seams. Now, if nails are clutching, it's giving it a human quality, which means that it's personification. Now, these nails clutching, that's an interesting verb use, highlights really a sense of desperation and an attempt for safety and security. And again, all that this is doing is highlighting the precarious nature of these structures. Now, before we move on to the latter half of the poem, I wanted to just draw your attention to this second sentence. There are not enough straight lines. That is the problem. Now, what problem really is Dharker talking about? Now, it's quite obvious to think that the very first problem is that we've got the fact that these buildings look on near collapse. These buildings are teetering, they look precarious. So we've got a problem of physical structures, this problem that's very real and very in front of us. But if we widen this out metaphorically, and why these structures exist, we have a wider issue of social division and inequality in India and the wider world. So we have two layers here, the reality of the physical structures being precarious and the metaphorical problem of class and social structures and wider inequality. Moving on, it says the whole structure leans dangerously towards the miraculous. And that's a good illustration of something leaning dangerously, and it is quite miraculous that is standing up, to be honest. No need to overanalyze this. This adverb implies real dangers and risks, but normally when we get a word like dangerously, we would generally expect something bad to happen to follow it. But here Dharker gives us an unexpected twist and says that it's miraculous that these buildings are standing. Now, miraculous has connotations, or religious connotations, and it also implies a sense of hope, something that's admirable, something that we should be in awe of. So, as I've mentioned, there's a tension and contrast between the dangerously and what we expect to follow dangerously, and the miraculous, which is something wonderful. Now, this unexpected twist is quite important, or this change, because the tone shifts in the poem pretty much from this point. The detachment that we see at the start changes and mutates into a more reflective speaker, a more emotive speaker in the final stanzas of the poem, or the final stanza in particular. Into this rough frame, someone has squeezed a living space. Now, this is a demonstrative adjective. It kind of puts the reader in the scene. It's almost as if the speaker is pointing out this building and in bewilderment that someone can actually squeeze a living space, a home there. And this squeeze is a restrictive verb. Now, if you notice with regards to the form of this poem, you'll see that this short stanza is literally squeezed in between the other two. It's only 3 lines long, and the stanza mirrors, is reflective of this squeeze. And lastly, we've got a reference to the poem's title. Someone has squeezed a living space. Now, this is quite an ambiguous phrase, meaning it's quite unclear. It implies that, yeah, it's a space that someone can live in, but it's not quite a home, not something that's really quite desirable. And in this living space, someone has dared to place. Notice the rhyme there, peppered in space and place. And in this living space, someone has dared to place these eggs in a wire basket, fragile curves of white, hung out over the dark edge of a slanted universe. Okay, first word that stands out to me is dared. Someone's placing eggs out in this quite disordered, chaotic environment. It implies they're quite bold, quite courageous, and that there's a risk in doing so. These eggs could crack. And these eggs are a crucial key symbol of the poem. Okay, eggs represent new life and in some ways a hope. And ironically, quite cleverly, eggs are also a version of a living space, aren't they? Before hatching. And the eggs are described here as fragile curves of white. Notice the curves, not straight lines. This is firmly placed in their world. in contrast to the dark edge. So dark, white, edge, curves. We've got an array of oppositions and contrasts here. The dark edge of a slanted universe. This is a very interesting metaphor. Okay, and I think, again, Dharker is pointing towards the wider inequality in the world, that the world is not symmetrical. Some part of the world or the universe is leaning in favour of some people more than others. So again, hinting at a sense of inequality and pointing towards the social structures as well as the physical structures. So these eggs are gathering the light into themselves as if they were bright, thin walls of faith. Now, Dharker is quite stark, quite blatant here in her use of symbolism. She has immediately linked these eggs to faith. She's quite a religious woman, okay? And she's linked these eggs to faith and, as I've said, new life and hope. So she's been quite blatant here in her use of symbolism. But this resilience of putting the eggs out in amongst this chaotic environment is also imbued with a sense of fragility. These eggs are thin and fragile, so at any time, just like the buildings, they're easily breakable. So faith has the power to give people strength, but as I've said, it's also breakable. At any minute, it could cave in. But really here, the essence is that this poem ends on a note of tentative hope. So if we look at the key ideas, beauty and hope and strength can be found in surprising places. Eggs here are a symbol of faith and new life, but this hope is only tentative. The eggs, like the structure, is still precariously, or perilously, I would say, fragile. We've got the fragile curves and the thin walls, so remember, they can go at any time. It explores the idea of a home and a living space. What's the difference between these two? And it talks about the problems of the physical structures of slum housing, whilst also subtly alluding to the social structure of India and I would say the wider world, with the huge wealth divide and vast inequality. Moving on to form and structure. As I've mentioned, there's elements of rhyme, but there is no regular scheme or structure. This is a free verse poem, and the irregular stanza length and heavy use of enjambment reflect the chaos and disorder of the slums. Now, if you turn your anthology to the side, you will be able to quite accurately see that there is no regular structure to this poem. It's up and down, it's undulating, and that's really to reflect the scene that she's trying to describe. If we think about the way that the poem is structured and the ideas are sequenced, stanza 1 starts off with quite a broad description of the slum housing, and we gradually see a narrowing of the focus. We zoom in onto one building and the mood shifts, and then we focus on the eggs and this idea of potential hope or tentative hope. When we're thinking about what we could possibly compare to, William Blake's London is a pretty good one. I'm thinking maybe if the theme of how do the poets present the theme of place in these poems, this would be quite a good one. The poem is also about the experience of city life. Blake feels a kind of relentless despair and misery about the city, whereas Dharker expresses a sense of tentative hope. Blake is concerned with the buildings in terms of the institutions they represent, so we can think of the blackening church, we could think of the palace walls with the soldiers' blood, whereas Dharker is concerned with the domestic life of India and the structures, and also the wider structure of wider social structures of inequality. Both of these poems are probably a little bit concerned with social justice as well. I hope this has helped you somewhat. Check back and I might make some more videos. Thank you.